Hi, I'm Jared, and I'm going to talk about how I make copper and aluminum pendants. So, I'm not a fan of going to a store and buying jewelry. I think jewelry should be something that's personal to you and then be unique. So, I prefer to make my own. And what you'll see here in this first picture is the start of that process. What I'm doing is I'm just taking a piece of stock aluminum that I bought from Lowe's and using some drafting tools, I drew the shape of the aluminum pendant, which is just primarily a couple circles and then fillets to smooth them out. And a pro tip, if you will, drill all your holes before you start doing any work. It's quite a bit of a bummer to spend a bunch of time shaping something and then realize that you accidentally drilled your hole off center. But what I did is using pencil and drafting tools, I drew the shape I wanted to, and then using a center punch, I etched into the aluminum the design so that when I was filing it and cutting it, I wouldn't accidentally wipe away the design and lose it. So this next picture you'll see is part of the way through the process of shaping the aluminum. This is just, I've rough cut it using a saw, and you get the general shape of what it's going to look like, but it's clearly could use some more work to make it nice and pretty. So the next image you'll see is two of the finished pendants, the aluminum backing at least. And the difference between the two pictures is what I've done is I've used files and small jeweler's files to smooth everything out and get it to a nice round finish. And that's all by hand, just using my eyes and then filing any of the thicker large areas until it turned into a round circle. So with that, that's half the process, because the other half is to actually shape the piece of copper that's going to sit on top of the aluminum backing piece. And this image is the rough cutting of an orca design. And you can see here that it's starting to take shape. And from here to get the fine details, I actually had to make my own tools and some small saws and files to get all the fine details to come out. So the following image is another one of the pendants, which is going to be a compass rose, and you can see I've pretty much rough cut the whole thing. And even though it's straight lines, it was actually proved to be rather difficult because it is somewhat hard to make a straight line purely by hand. So once I had the pieces of copper cut out, I was posed with a bit of a challenge of how to solder the copper to the aluminum in an easy manner, and particularly how to do it without having the copper shift and move and not sit centered on the aluminum. So it took a little bit of creativity and thinking, and I came to the conclusion that I should try using my stovetop. So I have a small metal spatula, which is called a cheese tool, part of being in Wisconsin. And what I figured I could do is I could lay this metal spatula on top of the iron coils of my stove, heat up the stovetop, and then transfer that through the spatula and melt the solder. And that's exactly what I tried. So that was one part of the equation. The other part is how to actually apply the solder in such a way that everything would sit even and then they would bond evenly. So what I decided to do is I took a piece of the solder and then filed it into a fine powder. From there, I took the flux and painted it on the aluminum backing piece and on the back of the copper, and then sprinkled the fine solder onto the copper. And because the flux is a gel-like consistency, the solder stuck to it, and I built up a pretty thick layer of it. And from there, I just positioned the copper pieces on the aluminum pendant and simply just turned my stovetop onto max. And after a couple minutes, I could tell that the solder had melted and the flux was burning away. So I gave it about 30 seconds more just for good measure, and then turned it down. And once it had cooled, I cleaned it off. And it worked surprisingly well. First try, it worked perfectly, which impressed me. After that, there were some kind of finishing touches. So this is the final picture. You can see the end result of the work. I didn't really like the shiny copper luster, so I wanted to paint it, and I just got some run-of-the-mill dark gray Rust-Oleum that I painted over the whole pendant. And once that had cured, I used some sandpaper and only sanded off the copper pieces because they're raised up above the aluminum. It's pretty easy to do. And that really made the copper stand out against the dark background. And following that, the last thing I did just to preserve the paint is I I sprayed on a layer of polyurethane. And that's the finished product. It turned out it's a compass rose, an orca, and the bottom one, which is the one I'm wearing, is a old Japanese samurai symbol. So it was pretty fun. They each took about 10 to 12 hours, so it was a lot of time, but you get better each time you do it, and it was a blast. So thanks for listening to me, and I hope you have a good day.